JIMENA presents Voices of Jewish Refugees from the Middle East and North Africa. Join us for an enlightening event that explores the personal experiences of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews who fled their homes from the Middle East and North Africa. In sharing these stories, we hope to provide a launch point for conversations on contemporary anti-Semitism and cultural identity. The program will begin momentarily.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad that you're all here with us today. My name is Sarah Levin, and I'm the Executive Director of JIMENA. We organized this series, The Voices of Jewish Refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, because at JIMENA, we see that a critical voice that's missing from public discourse in this post-October 7th reality is the voices of former Jewish refugees from North Africa and the Middle East. As most of you know, there were 1 million Jews who were ethnically cleansed or fled state-sanctioned anti-Semitic persecution throughout the Middle East and North Africa in the 20th century. And these same forces of anti-Semitism that led to the displacement of 1 million Jews continue to cause irreparable harm to Jewish communities who are still in Israel and the Middle East at large. You can't, as JIMENA's co-founders and former Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa have always said, you cannot understand the Middle East and the current conflict and crises in the Middle East if you don't listen to the voices of Jews and other religious and ethnic minorities from the region. So today I'm so honored and I'm so happy to be here with Gina Waldman, JIMENA's co-founder and president. I'm going to ask her some questions. I encourage you to write some questions in the chat if you have any. And we're going to hear from Gina about her story and also about her observations and her understanding of the realities that we find ourselves in today, both here in the United States and in the Middle East. Gina is a former Jewish refugee from Libya. I'm not going to read through her bio because she's going to share her stories with us today. So Gina, welcome. I'm hoping that you can start by just giving us some background on where you came from, the conditions that you lived in and that you fled from, and a bit about that story of being ethnically cleansed from the country you were born in.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I agree that one story really tells the story of a million Jews. Our stories may be different. We lived in different countries, from Baghdad to Fez, or from, Alexandria to, any part of the Middle East. However, our story do resemble each other because at the very end, we were either expelled or forced to flee. So I'd like to start with basically sharing my childhood in Libya. I was born and raised in Tripoli, which is in Libya. And as a little girl, when I went to school for the first time to explore the schools in my neighborhood, we went to an Arab school, and the teacher at the first grade was telling 6-year-old little girls that in order to learn arithmetics, she taught that if you kill, if you have 10 Jews and you kill 5 of them, how many Jews do you have left to kill? This was the first real experience of hatred that I experienced. At that day, I was really scared and traumatized, and I ran to my mom and said, does that mean that we are going to be killed? So later on, my parents put me in a Catholic school where I experienced also anti-Semitism, but not to that level. Eventually, at the age of 14, I decided that I wanted to study outside of Tripoli. And I heard that there were boarding schools abroad. And when my parents refused to send me, I went on a hunger strike for 5 days and threw a lot of tantrums. Eventually, they let me go. And one experience really was still etched in my memory is the fact that when I arrived at the border of Switzerland, where I was to go to boarding school, the officer looked at my laissez-passer because Jewish people were not given a passport. We were not recognized as citizens of Libya, just like many other Jews in different Arab countries were not recognized as such. So he looked at my travel document and said, well, you cannot enter the country with this travel document. And he told me that I had to go back to Tripoli, where I came from. So I was 14 years old. I started crying and I didn't know what to do. And eventually, just as the time got closer for me to go back to Tripoli, I ran over to the officer, and I at the time I only spoke very few words in English and also Italian and Arabic. So I pulled on his sleeve and I said, me no passport because me Jewish, me no passport because me Jewish, and I was crying. So at that point, he took my travel document, stamped it, opened the gate, and said, welcome to Switzerland. So for the first time in my life, I realized that speaking out when an injustice is being done to you, that is really important. And for the first time, I realized that declaring that I was a Jew so openly actually helped me rather than, the other way around. So that kind of based my entire career on fighting for human rights, not just for Jews, but for other people, like in Russia and during the Pinochet regime, and in Argentina and Chile and so forth. So after my experience in Switzerland for 2 years, I went to England for 2 years to study. And when I got back to Libya in the summer of 1967, the war broke out between Israel and 5 of its Arab neighbors. It was what they call today the 6-Day War. At the time, I was working at the office of a British company, temporary job, when my mother called and she said that the mob had surrounded our home and they were going to burn it down. When an Arab neighbor, an Egyptian man, came down to tell the people that were rioting that there were no Jews left in the building, that they had to leave, that there were only Muslim brothers there. He succeeded in chasing them away, but they left a white X on the building. The white X determined that a second group of people would come around all the Jewish buildings and they would burn them down. So fortunately, because of the intervention of this Muslim man, the mob didn't come around to our house. They came around, but they didn't burn it down, although they already had put gasoline around the building close to the cars. I was at the time hiding at the home of the British director of the British company that I'm working for, because the driver of the company decided that he wasn't going to take home a dirty Jew, and my mother called desperate to say not to come home because I would be giving them away, and they were afraid that would happen. So I hid in Brian Foreman's home with his wife for about a month, and then just at the time that Brian and his British engineering friends got together and decided that the only way they could smuggle myself and my family out of the country was inside the crates that they received from England with all the machinery, because they were building the airport at the time in Tripoli. So just during that time, the king gave a declaration that Jews could leave so long as everything would be confiscated. I'm not sure whether that was a declaration by the king or by the government at the time. However, I then rejoined my family. And when we did, my father had asked one of the officers that came around to get our passports that he would actually make sure that we would arrive at the airport safely. When the day came of first of all, we didn't have seats on the plane because Britishers and Americans were fleeing from Tripoli, and there were very few planes leaving because the government there was a lot of demonstrations and burning of Jewish properties, and my father's warehouse also was burned to the ground. So, not knowing how to get seats on the plane, the engineer, Brian, who was hiding in his home, was best friends with the director of what is today British Airways. In those days was called BOSC. And he convinced him to take 7 British engineers leaving for the island of Malta and replace them with our family. So that's how we got the seats on the plane. Eventually, I rejoined my family. We arrived, we were picked up very early hours by militia. They were military men wearing black boots and wearing shotguns that came to pick us up like at 5 or 6 in the morning. They loaded us on the back of a truck, including my 80-year-old grandparents. And they took us supposedly to the airport, but halfway to the airport, they stopped at a hotel at the outskirts of town. And they ordered us to get out of the truck, and they told us, you're dirty Jews. We're not going to take you to the airport. We're not protecting you. You're killing our brothers in Palestine. We're not going to, waste our time taking care of you, your dirty dogs, and so forth, on and on in Arabic. Eventually, we were, of course, scared, very scared. We got off the truck, and they said, you can take the bus. At that moment, a bus conveniently showed up right by the hotel. We had no choice. We took the very little luggage. We were only allowed $20, the equivalent of $20, and 1 suitcase per person. So we took the little suitcases we had, we boarded the bus, and we took off. Halfway to the airport, in those days, Tripoli was not developed. The roads were not quite dirt roads, but they weren't very developed to the airport. All of a sudden, the bus pulled over to the side of the road, and I was sitting in the back, and I could see that the conductor and the driver were pulling a lever on the bus, and I didn't know what was going on because they pulled over and they stopped for a while. So I ran over to them and asked them what was going on, and if we could just, we had to make the plane, would they please go to the airport? And at that point, I was pushed back by the conductor, the one who took the ticket, supposedly, pushed back against the chair, and he called me, "You filthy Jewish whore, you're killing my brothers in Palestine. Besides, you have nothing to do with this. I'm going to go get you a taxi." Well, at that moment, obviously, there was, it was the intention that he had was not obviously to get a taxi. So I let him get off the bus. And when I saw that he was no longer in view, I told my parents that I was going to try to get help or try to get a taxi. I ran as fast as I could. I passed a kind of like a hut of Arab men that were smoking the tergila, and then they were also drinking tea or smoking, and at the same time they were listening to Abdel Nasser, who that particular moment was abdicating his post on radio, because that was the very day which we didn't realize that they showed on the Arab TV and not on they would not allow it on BBC, to show that the Arabs had lost and they were running in the Sinai desert. But to the Jewish people or to the public, we only knew that Israel lost the war. This was nearly 1 month after we were not allowed to hear anything about the war, except that Israel had lost the war. But that day was when Jamal Abdel Nasser was abdicating. So as I was passing, I could hear the hymn of the national hymn of Libya and people singing and praises to Jamal Abdel Nasser, which at the time I didn't realize how critical that moment was, because this was true defeat for the Arabs. They realized what was really going on. So I kept moving, and I realized that if I ran in front of this group of young men, I might be in worse danger than being killed, such as being raped and tortured. So I decided to walk very slowly, and I reached a small gas station, and I asked the man outside the gas station if I could use the phone. But I realized also that if I asked him in English, in Arabic, he would know I was Jewish, because only Jews spoke Arabic. And I didn't want to ask him in Italian, because only Jews spoke Italian and Arabic. So I asked him in English, and for a miracle, he said, okay. I went into the small booth that was very small, like it was a small office. And I called the British engineer, Brian Foreman, and told him, I wanted to call him actually, but at that time, the conductor that was on the bus, who called me dirty whore, was there using the phone himself. So he had his hand on the phone and he wouldn't let me use it. So out of fear and desperation, not knowing what to do, I grabbed the phone from his hand and I turned it against the wall. I didn't want to face him for fear that I would be too scared. And I dialed the number of Brian Foreman and told him, basically, we're in danger, we're in the middle of the road. And typically I have a terrible sense of directions, but I was able to tell him that it was past the gas station and there would be a bus on, off the road. So just as I hang up and turned around, now the door of the little office was blocked by 3 Arab men. And the man I asked to use the phone, the conductor, and a third man that appeared from nowhere. They blocked my way, and there was no way I could get out. So I just, out of impulse, I just pushed my way out, which I don't think they expected. And I caught them by surprise, and I just kept running, even past the booth with the shy drinkers and so forth. And I went back to the bus, where I saw a huge pool of gasoline under the bus. So at that moment, only when my family was still on the bus, I realized what was happening, that the plan was to burn the bus with all the family inside. So I realized that our life was really in that box of matches. So I started to follow the driver with the packet of matches anywhere he moved. He went to the right, I went to the... I just kept following like a crazy person. And my eyes were concentrated in his hand, because that's where the matches were. Our lives were locked in that box of matches. So eventually, only very few minutes later, I saw, while my family was still on the bus and I didn't want to panic them by telling them what was going on, I looked for a minute, and my grandmother is crying, my grandfather is praying, my mother is completely out of it, my father is, paralyzed with fear. That was the scene inside the bus. So I stayed outside, and then eventually I saw a lot of farmers and people just going to their farms with donkeys and walking, and the Mujahideen, started calling the prayer. It was like 6 o'clock in the morning, and you could hear that from a distance. And these people started surrounding us and started calling us Yehud, Yehud, Jews, Jews. So thankfully, about 10 or 15 minutes later, two Jeeps, what actually looked like an eternity, two Jeeps pulled over, and it was Brian and another neighbor of his also worked for the company. And they both took one look at what was happening. They're both mechanical engineers, and they said, "Oh my God, this bus is ready to explode." They grabbed a few of our bags, left the rest, and we boarded the two Jeeps, and we took off to the airport. When we arrived at the airport, one of the was the BOSC, British Airways workers, looked at our tickets and our travel documents and said, "Boublil, you're not supposed to be here." Well, it was obvious that this whole thing had been prearranged. So we, after they stripped us, they took our suitcases, pulled whatever few silver things we had. They took them, and they threw the suitcases upside down so that we couldn't repack them anymore. Eventually, we were able to board the flight. And just as the engine started moving and they announced that the flight was leaving and they closed the door, I counted the members of my family, and I realized that my uncle, the brother of my father, was missing. So I started screaming in English to the pilots and the stewardesses to stop the plane. They did. I ran outside, went back into the airport section, and my uncle was surrounded by the people who work there, and mechanics and so forth, and he was being surrounded, and the people were saying to him, one of them actually had a knife in his hand, and they said, "We're going to cut you into pieces. You're filthy dogs. You're killing our brothers in Palestine. you know, and my uncle was, needless to say, paralyzed with fear. So I grabbed him. I entered the circle that he was surrounded in. I grabbed him again by surprise and basically had to drag him because he was so emotionally distraught and paralyzed with fear. And we made it back into the plane. When we got into the plane and we landed in the island of Malta, which is the first territory outside of Libya and outside of any Arab countries, there were doctors and stretchers and like Red Cross type ambulances that came to greet us. And apparently the pilot realized what was happening and he called ahead for medical assistance. And they started interrogating us. And my father said, don't say anything because there are lots of Jews still left in Libya. And if we say something, they would have consequences. So from there, we went to Italy. And 2 years later, I migrated to the United States, to San Francisco, as a refugee. So that's basically my story.
Oh, you want to take a sip of water, Gina? It's a lot.
Yeah,
yeah, take a sip of water. It's okay. I think it's really harrowing. Obviously, it's incredibly harrowing and frightening to hear your story. And then when you realize that more than half of Israel's Jewish population descend from Jews whose parents and grandparents came from the Middle East and North Africa and fled or were ethnically cleansed, you begin to understand the situation in the politics and the psychology of Israel in a much different way. So thank you for sharing that. So I want to fast forward many years. You had a very illustrious career as a human rights advocate, particularly with the movement to free Soviet Jewry. You were one of the leaders. I know there are many leaders, but you really were one of the primary West Coast grassroots activist leaders. But I want to speed up to September 11th. And the second intifada on college, the second intifada and its impact in the United States on college campuses, which I think what we're seeing today is an echo of that time. This was the time that you started JIMENA with Joseph Abdelwahed, who's since passed. I really want to hear, and I don't think you've ever talked about this, the story of founding JIMENA. What was the impetus that led you and Joe to create this organization? Why did you do it? Why did you wait so many years to tell your story? Just share with us the founding of JIMENA.
For about 20 some years, I worked as a executive director of the Soviet Jewry, Bay Area Council for Soviet Jews. In fact, I'm proud to say I've been arrested 3 times for civil disobedience, for chaining myself to the gates of the Soviet consulate, for convincing rabbis and priests to chain themselves to me, for organizing any kind of hunger strike or demonstration or sitting at the consulate for many years. Because we realized at the time that the media was getting tired of just having people with signs, let my people go. So we had to be very creative. So I became very creative in that department. I figured my philosophy was confrontation, but not violence. And I took the Gandhian approach. So having had all that experience and having traveled to Russia, followed by KGB,
and stopping an airplane in Tripoli, Libya to save an uncle. I don't know that anyone has that story. Sorry.
Yes, I look back now and I realize how much our young people and people in general take freedom, really as something that is a given thing, but it isn't. And that's why I love this country, because I fight for democracy and freedom and rule of law, because I realized how important that is. So having had all that experience, I met Joe Wahed's mother really first, and She was quite a wonderful lady, Sarina Wahed. And through her, I met also her son, Joe Abdel Wahed, and he kept telling me, "Oh, you have so much experience with Soviet Jewry. We have to tell our story." He used to use the word, "We have to tell our story." And at first, it was like, what is in our story? I really was not as aware of the importance of our story as he was. And I have to give that credit to him because he had a vision of what the story was. He knew that our story is basically the counterweight to the Palestinian refugee story. And I eventually, of course, slowly but surely came around, and we had a meeting about it. And uh, what really woke me up was September 11, when all the media kept saying that, oh, uh, it is because out of desperation, this is out of poverty, it is out of the occupation that the 9/11 took place. I stood up at the Herman Plaza in San Francisco where they're having a rally, and I decided that I was not going to direct my speech to the Jewish people, but I was going to do it to the Arabs. And I kept calling on the Arabs and the Arab sisters to see how their philosophy, the hatred for the Jews, was taking their children to the corridors of death. I use the word corridors of death, and that it's time for them to build a country rather than keep building hatred against Israel. They have to choose. They either could build a country of their own and educate the children in a culture of coexistence, or send their children to be murdered as jahids and suicide bombers. And at that point, the people were so at the rally were really, I think, somehow they saw a different point of view, because everyone else was talking about the subject of mourning the people who had been killed and all the Jews had been murdered in the discotheques. I took a completely different approach. And the reason I took that approach was the night before I spoke, I was reading the article and I saw two photographs of two young ladies. The one that was murdered by a suicide bomber in a supermarket because she went shopping for her mother for Shabbat, and the girl who was the suicide bomber. They almost looked like sisters. They were the same age. They were both beautiful, and they both were murdered, innocent lives. So that's really what inspired me at the time. And I think that I always look for ways that there should be reconciliation. And it's very sad that a lot of Arab leaders have led their population in Gaza and the West Bank today to continue hating the Jews and hate curriculum, which will not give anyone any relief from any war or suicide bombing. So that's really how it got started. People started calling me after my speech, and they wanted me to go to different colleges to make speeches. I'd never made speeches in my life. And so we started JIMENA, and someone gave us the name Jews Indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa, which covers really what we do.
Yeah. I have a question. So I've been thinking about this lately, about what happens to societies when Jews leave or when anti-Semitism rises and rises and rises. And I've been thinking about how Jews are kind of a canary in a coal mine for the health of a society. And there's this pattern that exists that when Jews are ethnically cleansed or fled or severely oppressed in countries throughout the world, that the health of the society just kind of unravels once the Jews are gone. And the country that you come from is a prime example of that, that there's no Jews left. Every Jew is ethnically cleansed. Libya has been in a state of deterioration for some time now. And I see what's happening in the United States with the rise of anti-Semitism here and the polarization that we're currently living. And I can't help but think about this as falling in with that pattern of history. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that and your observations and your reflections on anti-Semitism here in the United States after all of you have survived and lived through and seen. It's not really a question. It's more of you sharing your thoughts on do you believe that the rise of anti-Semitism in our country is indicative of our country going down a really dangerous path and our society going down a really dangerous path?
Yes, I first of all, I'm actually still to this day shocked after what happened in our universities. And my question is always, we know that in Sudan, hundreds of thousands of people are either starved to death or killed, or their villages being burned, some taken into slavery. And I have not seen demonstrations in campuses to protest what's going on in Sudan. Ethiopia, some 200,000 people or so, because of the civil war, were murdered, innocent people. I didn't see demonstrations. We're talking about Africa. We're talking about Venezuela, where one after another, these dictators take charge of the country with no rights, where they are defeated by elections and they still not a single demonstration. How about Iran? What happened to the women in Iran? We have good friends that are Iranians and tell us horror stories of mass graves that are not even shown in any public media or any media whatsoever. I have not seen a single demonstration against Russia invading Ukraine, not a single one. And yet, the day after Hamas murdered brutally 1,200 people, Israelis, and raped women in their homes and in their kibbutzim. And God knows, I don't want to go into details what happened to their children and all of that. The day after, before Israel entered a war, there was a huge demonstration in New York in Times Square supporting Hamas. And you wonder, so all of a sudden, the perpetrators are being honored and encouraged to continue such barbaric acts. And that is very, very scary. So if you think about the culture we live in, you have to wonder what is being taught in our schools. What, in Italian, there is an expression, the children talk because the parents have talked. What are these children being taught or given as values in their own homes? And that is why I think that JIMENA continues to work against the ethnic studies program. And that is something that we have to pursue very, very, with a lot of rigor, because at the age of 6, a child already knows what's right and what's wrong, and they know what hatred is. And so long as the child who's 6 years old or from K to 12 is giving misinformation about Jews and who they are and what our history is, this anti-Semitism will grow. And it's not only in this country, but all over the world.
Yeah. One thing that I see happening here in the United States that happened, the exact same language was used in the Arab world in the legal system, is the interchangeability between Jews and Zionists. Jews and Zionists. Zionism was not defined in the Arab world, but it was used as a pretext to persecute Jews and to accuse them of crimes that they did not commit. And it scares me when I see these words anti-Zionist and Zionist being thrown around to put a value on someone as being either good or bad, evil or positive.
Right.
It's very scary that that pattern has persisted and is here in the United States.
Yes, and you're right, because Zionism is actually a crime in Arab countries.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you're accused of being a Zionist, you could go to jail. And many Jews who, arbitrary arrests were very common in most of the Arab countries. So from one day to the next, police will show up at your doorstep and say, we are accusing you of Zionism, and they throw you in jail, and they have what we call trumped up charges. Yeah. And so Zionism has been really considered a crime in most, if not all, Arab countries. I mean, in Iraq, they had the Farhud, which was inspired by the Nazi propaganda, and in 1942, and when the Farhud is what we known as a pogrom, and when the Iraqis in Baghdad and other places in Iraq rioted against the Jews and went to the Jewish quarters, they murdered and maimed and many, many Jews. And the British, who at the time were in charge, did nothing to stop it. So you wonder, why didn't they stop it? And, you beg the question of, were they just allowing it to happen, to let the Arabs have their day to kill the Jews? It's very scary to think about us being a country and a people that cannot depend on others to defend us. I think really this comes to be the key question. I think it was Golda Meir who said, we have one secret weapon. Israel is the only country we can be in. I'm paraphrasing. Really, Israel is the only country where we hope that we have a defense system in place, and that, we can defend ourselves. We cannot if we live in a different country where we are still, even though we are Americans, we can suffer anti-Semitism under the American flag, and that Arabs and Muslims and pro-Hamasniks can actually be allowed to burn American flags with impunity. And they can put Nazi slogans in dormitories of Jewish students. Still, I think at the end of the day, the only way that I can see a general way to move forward with this is when the Palestinian people themselves get rid of their corrupt leadership and decide that they want a future for their children, and that they would rather spend time building a country for themselves, develop a country for themselves, develop a healthy educational system that does not teach hatred. They could have a country. If they decide that they want to pursue hatred curriculum in the schools, send their children to summer camps that teach how to become a jihadi or a suicide bomber or join Hamas, because the goal is to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews and push them into the sea. That's when they will never have a country. They cannot
I
be.
totally agree with you.
Israel is never going
Really
to go
agree with
away.
you. And I want to just add on. Yeah. I want to add on to something that you said earlier and kind of clarify it, because I've heard a lot of people push back on JIMENA for this perception that the organization was created to neutralize or discredit or undermine Palestinians and Palestinian the case. I think one of the strengths of JIMENA and you and Joe and others speaking out early on, it wasn't, the intention of JIMENA was never to tell the Palestinians to sit down and say, you don't have a voice, you don't exist, your claims don't mean anything. It was created to counter the anti-Semitic propaganda and messaging, like Jews being all white colonial usurpers in the Middle East. It was created to ensure that the Holocaust isn't the only narrative that's being taught about Jewish history and its connection to Israel. It was actually, I think, in what you were saying, it was created to empower Palestinians and all Middle Eastern people and all people towards a path of peace and education and economic empowerment. Jews from Arab countries had billions of dollars worth of properties confiscated and came to Israel as stateless refugees living in tents in the mud and built something out of nothing. And that's the story, I think, that I know that you and others wanted to share early on. But related to that,
But
I have a question for you, because we're seeing this now in younger circles of Jews, of the fringe Jews who have aligned themselves with the pro Hamasnikim and the anti-Israel, anti-Zionism crowds. There's this like desire for young people whose parents or grandparents came from the Arab world to identify as Arab Jews. And I know this is controversial, and I know identity is deeply personal, and JIMENA has always privileged self-identification above all else. But every single Jewish person who I've ever talked to, whether in Israel, the United States, or in other countries, who came from those countries, would never identify as an Arab Jew. So can you talk about this and what it means to you as someone who came from the Arab worlds in North Africa? Like, do you identify as an Arab Jew? Do most Mizrahi Sephardi Jews identify as Arab Jews? Can you set the record straight on this?
I think that it's really a question of historic facts. First of all, Bedouins are not Arabs, okay? Jews are not Arabs. Therefore, they're not Arab Jews. The Arab conquest dates much later than the Jewish history. The Arab conquest of the 7th century came in the 7th century, whereas Jews were Jewish since 5,000 years ago. We talk about Babylonia and Iraq and Iran, where Jews were already there nearly 5,000 years ago. So the Arab conquest came much later. The Arab nations conquered many of the countries that they occupied, and the reason why in Arabic they call the Muslim religion Din al-Sayd, it means the religion of the sword. If you don't convert to Islam, we cut your head. That's what they did in the Arabian Peninsula, which is today Saudi Arabia. So definitely we're Jews and we're not Arab Jews. That, I think, clarifies.
And I think also,
Bedouins are not Arabs.
Yeah.
And the
There's
Kurds
so many indigenous groups from the Middle East and North Africa. And for anyone to flatten all of these diverse ethnicities, religions, and identities into Arab is feeding an imperialist narrative. It's feeding a colonialist narrative. So it's confusing to me why young anti-Zionists want to identify.
Right. So, but it's also historically incorrect. So,
yeah, for sure.
Okay, so historically incorrect. So the other piece, it's like calling Persians or Iranians. My friend, she's Iranian, but she calls herself a Persian because her ancestry is Persian and not Iranian. So again, you can go, but the other piece which I want to share is that JIMENA actually, in all of our presentations and speakers, we always said that the Palestinian refugee issue needs to be addressed, and the Jewish refugee issue needs to be equally addressed. We always use that word, equally. Yeah. These were words from Stan Ehrman, who really also guided the language of how we should present ourselves. And in any testimonials that we ever gave, whether it's at the UN or any other public forum, we always said that. The other piece which is interesting is that we have never actually, if one of our speakers or any of our speakers ever criticize in a malicious way or in a hateful way either the Palestinians or the Arab countries, they would be taken off the Speakers Bureau, because the idea was to build bridges, not to destroy bridges.
Yeah, and in all of the conversations around intersectional identities, I think that is one piece that I'm really proud of at JIMENA, is that that as an institution, we've used our diverse Middle Eastern identities to build bridges with other Middle Eastern communities. And that's all with the intention of building bridges and education and creating a better future for all of our children.
Exactly. And just as an anecdote, I was invited to Minnesota some time back to speak on Human Rights Day. They have a very strong human rights department. And the students invited me because they heard me speak there for a Jewish Hillel function. And I took specifically all the Muslim girls, only the Muslim girls, and I dressed them up with our costumes. And they were unbelievably happy, because they said, one girl from Yemen said, "Oh my God, that's how my grandmother used to wear this kind of costume." And we told the story of her family, just like we told the story of my family. So students themselves, when they wanted to invite me as the main speaker for the Human Rights Day, the Muslim community refused to have me speak. And they went to the professor to ask for help. And with the help of the professor from the university, I was able to speak there. And afterwards, we shared bread together and meal and so forth. So I think that there is also always a preconceived notion from a lot of Arab and Muslim groups that we are all Zionists and we're never going to be sympathetic to them. And the idea is to hate the Jews because we are infidels. Well, that will not change unless the school system changes and unless the imams stop doing this during their speeches.
Yeah, that actually leads in to my next question. We're running close to time, so I have two more questions. So I've always been kind of disturbed by the fact that so many social justice seeking Americans have placed their Western ideologies or perceptions onto the Middle East and have not taken the anti-Semitic language and rhetoric of governments in the region or the history of what happened to Jews or the agenda of Assyrians and Yazidis at face value, meaning they've never taken the threat seriously. They've never taken the history seriously, at least from my perception. So when October 7th happened, I know I wasn't the only one who experienced this. There are other Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews who were angry and who had said, we've been telling you that they hate us, and they mean what they say. Hamas means what they say when they say they want us gone from the river to the sea, and clearly they've succeeded in the rest of the region. So October 7th was not, I don't think, I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone else, but my assumption is that it was not a huge surprise to many Middle Eastern Jews, to many Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews, especially Jews who are from the region. Was October 7th a surprise to you? And as a Mizrahi woman who was born in the region, what was your response to Western reactions? What was your
Yes. First of all, I was, of course, very upset and very shocked. I think that what we learned from the Holocaust is that, again, there was apathy and there was silence and there was, indifference really in the world. Not just, I'm talking about the world in general, outside of the Jewish world. And I don't think that almost my anger was divided between the non-action of the non-Jewish world who sat there silently and did not protest such a crime because it didn't affect them directly. I was just as angry at those people as I was angry about what the Hamas did, because what shocked me the most is the silence that we experienced during the Nazi regime, when the entire world sat silently while 6 million Jews were being murdered. And I thought to myself, again, there you go again, that nobody really cares, because this is like a repeat performance. Was I surprised about the Hamasniks and how they dealt with the Jews? No, because my father buried the severed bodies of his own friends and relatives in the 40s, and he was forever traumatized. And actually, when we did leave Libya and all of those periods, traumatic experience came back to him, he became extremely depressed and basically not functioning because of the trauma that he had suffered so many years before. When we escaped, it all came back to him. So we know from trauma, and we know from being murdered cold blood. And again, my only message to the Palestinian people is, we know what it is to be a refugee, but we moved on because our own leaders and communities refused to allow us to sit in refugee camps. We moved on and we built a life for ourselves. I beg you to do the same thing. Do not listen to Hamas. Do not take your children to hateful curriculums in the schools. You have a responsibility to give your children a future. And so long as the only thing they know is to hate the Jews in Israel and to get rid of the Jews in Israel, you will never have a country of your own.
Gina, that message and the message that you've been sharing for 20 years gave me a lot of hope and inspiration back in 2002 when I was dealing with anti-Semitism on college campus and figuring out my understanding of Israel and the Middle East. That message of building, of creating a better future, of love for your children, but also your enemies' children as well, and understanding that your children will have a better future if they have a better future, and the insistence on dismantling all of the racism and the anti-Semitism that exists for the betterment of everyone has really had a huge impact on my life and given me hope in times when I felt hopeless. And I'm sure many, many, many other people. You're a rarity for a Middle Eastern woman who survived the traumas that you've survived and has come out strong with that message. I really hope it's an inspiration to all the Palestinian women and all women everywhere. So thank you for that. And I guess my last question is, what gives you hope now? It's in a time where we're all feeling like...
Well, I think what gives us hope is that we need to speak out all the time. I always say, well, actually, this is something that I want to say publicly, and I hope that maybe somebody outside of JIMENA could pick it up. During the Democratic Convention I was watching, the word came back again and again. When you see an injustice, speak out. When you see an injustice, speak out. My question is to the entire United States, how come when we saw the injustice of what was happening to Jewish students on campuses, nobody spoke out? That is my question. You saw an injustice. Anti-Semitism is an injustice. Why didn't you speak out?
Okay, well, thank you, Gina. Is there anything else before we end this? Is there anything else you want to share that's relevant to your experience on October 7th and all the work you've done?
I'm hoping that more and more organizations that will hear our story, and I hope that the curriculum that JIMENA has created, which is so wonderful, could be spread out to not just Jewish schools but others. And I also encourage every organization to invite our speakers to tell their story, to share their experience living as a Jew in an Arab country, but again, by sharing the story of one refugee and sympathizing with what it is to be a refugee, whether you're Palestinian or from Ethiopia or from Syria or from any other country. The refugee story is really a worldly story. It's the same story. We all come to different countries where we don't speak the language, we don't know anyone. We come into a country that integrates us, and we have to be willing. Again, we have to be willing to be integrated, because if we're going to go to France and the imam is telling us to hate the Jews of France, and we go out and start shooting the Jews of France, we have not been integrated. Why did we even bother to bring those hate values to a country that has opened the doors to us?
Yeah. Thank you. And actually, I'll give a plug right now for JIMENA before we say goodbye. This November is Mizrahi Heritage Month, which is the result of legislation that Gina and many others lobbied for in Israel back in 2014. November 30th is the International Day of Recognition for Jewish refugees from Arab countries. This year, our goal is to have as many of our eyewitness speakers visit as many campuses as possible throughout the United States to share their personal stories. This year, we're going back to kind of the roots of JIMENA, which is the storytelling and the personal connections between college students and former Jewish refugees. So if you work in a college campus or you're a student and you would like to bring one of our speakers to your university or college, please get in touch with us and we'll be happy to help arrange that. So thank you, Gina, and thank you everyone who's watching, and welcome to everyone who's watching after this streams, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.